Hey everyone, I'm back to talk about the science fiction fantasy books I've been reading recently. Most of these, if not all, are going to be new releases. And so I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, the ones that are worth the hype, the ones to skip. If that all sounds helpful, hopefully you stick around and hopefully you subscribe. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's start science fiction as I like to do, starting with A View from the Stars by Cixin. This is a short story collection that just came out this year. I've received a review copy from Tor, and this is very short, so it's good to know if you are going to purchase it. It contains a series of stories that have been published in other places and is now being recollected in this new hardcover edition. So there is at least one story from the Wandering Earth collection, as well as different magazines publications. So I had read a couple stories in here, but several of them were new to me. This is one that I think would be a perfect gift to someone perhaps who is just watching the TV show or reading through the books and, like me, have fallen in love with this author and are looking for something more. So I really enjoyed this. Yes, some of it was revisiting stories that I've read before, but I actually love rereading, so that was not an issue for me. I think it's a great introduction to the author's work. I personally loved the foreword, the discussions about the stories just as much as the stories themselves, because the author gives a lot of context to the history of science fiction in China, the history of his own relationship with the genre, and some of the kind of background and purpose of some of the stories that he did write. And if you're not aware, this author writes a lot of kind of big idea stories, often dealing with, like, the three-body problem story and its sequels, following with kind of these big events, what would happen if this happened to humanity, and having to see the fallout of that. So you see very similar themes as a story in here that deals with the dark forest theory. So again, he does bring back or recycle, for lack of a kind word, ideas that he explores in different forms, but I just love spending time with this author. As always, his books are more about the ideas than the characters, so if that's something important to you, if you really need to get attached to characters, you're not going to find that here. But again, I'm someone who normally passes on review copies of short stories. I rarely read them and rarely even more enjoy them, but I love this one. Easily one of my favorite science fiction new releases of the year. Highly recommend. I could read basically anything this author has written at this point. Love his stuff so much. Next we have The Dark Side of the Sky by Francesco Dimitri, and this is a really unique story. This one is set in a post-apocalyptic future, which perhaps is not a unique genre itself, but this book just feels very different than the other science fiction I read. So we follow a group of individuals who have set up this safe haven in Italy. They are a place that lost souls can come. And so while this is technically a piece of science fiction, has that, you know, a world building that supports it. Really, this one, as opposed to the last book I talked about, is very character focused. It's much more about these individuals in this setting and seeing their relationships, their struggles, and so forth. It's a book I picked up because I'm always looking for something out of the box. I feel like there is a lot of very tropey science fiction that is being published, especially when I'm looking at new releases. And so when I read or hear about something that's a little bit different, I'm immediately interested. This is one that I appreciated the author's attempt a little bit more than their execution. I'll be honest, this book didn't work very well for me. I didn't find myself very attached to the characters. I prefer stories with more of the world building, more of the understanding of the apocalyptic events, and instead this one felt a little bit young. It is classified, I believe, as adult science fiction, but it could have been a crossover with YA, just that it kind of had those characters coming of age and dealing with their own personal struggles, and it just isn't the focus of science fiction that I'm looking for. So this one didn't really come together for me. I thought it was attempting to do some interesting things, but did it in a way that just, again, kind of fell short of the potential. Next, let's talk about The Silverblood Promise by James Logan, and this is a new release. It is a fantasy story, not necessarily epic in nature, but very much set in a secondary world. We follow a young man who is our main character. You meet him at the beginning, you find out that he is a dropout of the schools of this land and instead just spends his time playing card games and drinking and having a good time. However, things quickly sober up when he finds out that his father has been murdered, and he takes it upon himself to try to solve the mystery or find out more of what happened. Now, I am someone who loves mystery stories, especially when they're woven nicely into a fancy setting. I think the two genres, for whatever reason, work very well together. If you see other favorites of mine, things like the Justice of Kings series, this one feels very much up that same alley. So again, it is set in a secondary world, but it feels a little bit more tight and intimate in terms of the focus. So we're following this young man who is the main character rather than multiple points of views in this wide scope. And instead we see the world through his eyes. It has the kind of gritty urban setting that I've come to really enjoy in these fantasy stories. I believe this one is compared to the work of Scott Lynch. So if you love the Liza Locke-Lamora, this is one that really does have a similar feel. I was both excited and nervous to accept a copy for review because of the fact that I'd heard really amazing early buzz. People were singing their praises about this. And if you follow my channel, you'll know that I'm often that person who kind of pops the bubble of the hype and gives a rather unpopular or differing opinion than all the early reviewers and will say, well, I don't know if it's actually that good. This one was really good, a solid 4 stars for me, and likely a 5-star read for a lot of other people, again, who more focus and specialize in reviewing fantasy. I thought that this was just well done. The characters are well developed and interesting and multifaceted. They're not just stereotypes, but instead really have flaws and quirks along the way. The mystery itself, again, was compelling in and of itself, and you have the beautiful backdrop of the fantasy world, which again, I thought, even though we are given this narrow view, I felt like the author did a really good way, without it ever feeling like info dumping, of giving us a larger picture of what is happening and letting us kind of figure that out along the way. So if you can't tell, I really enjoyed this one. Again, it's the first in the series. I will 100% pick up the next book, and this will easily be among my favorites of 2024 when it comes to fantasy, because it's doing what I love very well, and for once I'm happy to say the hype was completely true. This one in my mind is worth your time. If you read fantasy, this one is going to be a winner. Next, let's talk about Relics of Ruin by Erin M. Evans, and this is a second book in a series that starts out with a very similar plot actually to the last book, where we have a main character who stumbles into a mystery and they have to try to figure out what is going on. They're pulled into something larger themselves, and this next book kind of picks up. It's almost like a second episode where we follow very similar characters and they're puzzling through yet another mystery. I'm kind of cautious to give away too much. Again, it's always hard to talk about book 2 without kind of giving away everything that happens in book 1, but I would say that I went to this book with tempered expectations because of the fact that I liked but did not love book 1, and my feelings generally continued in this one. So it's kind of interesting to review this one right after the Silverblood Promise, because again, they really do kind of have similar plots in terms of the generalities of how the pieces come together, but this one just pales in comparison to that one. This one has characters that are fine, but I didn't find them to be as nuanced or interesting or memorable as I would have liked them to be. The mystery itself felt a little bit simplistic, and I think had you stripped away all of the fantastical elements to the story, I don't know if the mystery itself would have held up without kind of those magical elements around it with all the archiving and so forth. So I liked to a degree what the story is doing. I appreciate it to a degree. I think your enjoyment of this one is really going to be based off how you felt about book 1, because again, I think that this book is very much on par. I'm not just saying that it's a step down. Really, this is very similar to my review of the first book. I think it's doing some interesting things, or attempting to do it, but I don't think it's really hitting the nail. I don't think it's doing anything I haven't read before, or in a way that I find more interesting than in other books that I think I would recommend reading first if you haven't yet. So I'm a little bit indifferent on this series. I would possibly see where it goes from there. I think it's easy to read, it's easy to fly through, but I'm definitely looking for it to be a bit more special than it is. Next, we have The Sword Unbound. This is a book that is the follow-up to The Sword Defiant, a book that I reviewed last year. This is a piece of epic fantasy, and in the first book, we follow a group of characters, a group of heroes that come together to fight against the evil lord. They have to get this object in order to save everyone, and it's a story that I thought was well written, with good character work and good plotting and so forth, but very, very traditional in terms of a fantasy narrative. So doing those tropes very well, but definitely leaning heavily into the tropes of things in the vein and legacy of something like Lord of the Rings, which of course is amazing, and I recognize nothing is ever going to fully compare to that. So mostly I was a little bit disappointed because this author is the same one who wrote The Gutter Prayer, which is one of my favorite fantasy backlist titles, because in my mind, that one is just really unique, it's out of the box, and just a little bit unexpected in what it does. And this series is just a hard one for me personally to follow up with, because after reading that one, I keep comparing it each time I pick up these books and just find this series to be so much more safe, I guess is the word I want to use. But in terms of this series, let me kind of focus on this. Without that as a comparison, this follow-up book I do think is solid. It moves the plot forward. I like that, and again, I can't really talk specifics, but it jumps ahead in time and deals with the aftermath of book 2 in a way that I think is interesting, and it does develop the characters. There are consequences to what happened in the last book, and I think that I appreciate the author trying to stretch themselves a little bit more and give a book with deep stakes and sacrifice and characters along the way. So I very much, you can tell, I appreciate this book. I had a fairly good time with it, but for me to love a book, to see me gushing about it on camera, the book has to do something pretty unique or do those tropes so amazingly well that I forget that they are familiar. And this book, while doing a great job, just never really hit the mark of being something that really got me excited as I was reading, and again kind of fell in quiet comparison to some of the books that I really love that I think are just doing something a little bit more innovative, which is what I'm hoping this author will return back to after the series. And I also received a copy of City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is technically a backlist book, but they sent it because this just came out, and that is House of Open Wounds, also of course by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And these books follow a particular city that has darkness about it. It is so hard to describe the city. I kept postponing preparing this video because I just didn't quite know how to describe this on camera. So this is one that is focused around this dark city and the people who live there. It is one that is very unique, and I picked it up admittedly because I've really enjoyed a lot of this author's previous work, mostly on the science fiction side, but I did want to try out more of their fantasy. And I will say they definitely have a particular writing style that doesn't necessarily work for my taste. I like but don't love it as much as other people do, but again, other people do love that writing, so if you're one of them and tend to really love how they put out their stories, I think you'll enjoy these ones as well. I just found it kind of a strange narrative setup where we have this city and we have these characters, but I didn't feel as closely tied or connected to them as I would like to be, which if you follow my channel closely, you'll know that that typically is my criticism or struggle when it comes to reviewing this author's work, is that he presents really interesting worlds with really supposedly interesting characters, but he keeps the reader at an arm's length the way that he narratively writes, which again is my personal complaint, in a way where it just feels like he's never really fully letting me in. I don't feel like I fully understand the motivations of the characters or the nuances of the world, and I can see that he has really interesting ideas, but I don't feel like, for me, he doesn't necessarily project them in a way that translates, and so I feel like I'm in the loop, that I feel like I understand what is in his mind that he's trying to portray and explain. And so I appreciate these stories, but didn't love them. I feel like I've said that way too many times in this video. This is very much a time where I read a whole bunch of new releases, and I'm trying to put into words how I feel about them when my feelings are mixed, which comes into a lot of appreciation, but not necessarily enjoyment, if you catch on my meaning there. So anyway, all that being said, I do think that people who, again, love his fantasy work, love his writing, should definitely go check this out. I'm not sure if I'll continue on with the series just because this one didn't work very well for me. I didn't have the best impression of it and just found myself reading for the sake of reviewing rather than really enjoying and getting engrossed in the world the way that I want to be. And next is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the first book in a new fantasy mystery series. I realize I actually have several of these in this video here. So this one starts out with a murder of a high official officer in this mansion, and so of course these detectives, both the senior and then their assistant, are called in to investigate. The dynamics between those two very much feel similar to, just in terms of the narrative trope, of something like Sherlock Holmes and Watson, where you have the brilliant mind and the one who is following them around and transcribing their work along the way. And so they're of course called in to try to solve the mystery, and the story goes from there. This is one that I want to pick up because I've read several other things by this author, and I tend to really enjoy their work. They aren't necessarily always a 5-star read for me, but they consistently are 4 stars, and that was very much the case here. I thought that they developed a really good mystery. Again, I always like to do the test where if you take away the fantastical elements that surround this story, I feel like the mystery itself holds up. If you set this in New York City in the present day, I would still be interested enough to know what happened to this man and to follow these detectives around. However, of course, it is set in a secondary world, so you get those added moments, the added details and fantastical elements that really, in my mind, add another layer of interest to the story, which is what the author does here. I enjoyed this one. I will admit it is more slow paced than I would want it to be, and I did find the characters interesting, but not quite as memorable as I've had other detectives. I think it's hard because, again, this mystery genre in general is so done and overdone that I think it's hard to always write a new type of detective that doesn't feel like a trope or just simply regurgitating a previous detective I've read before. But how do you make them unique in another way without it feeling odd or out of place? And so I really like this one for what it's doing. I think that there is room to grow. I think I will like the characters more as there are more books in the series, I understand. So again, it's kind of the case where as you become more attached to them, you spend more time with them. I could see myself really coming to love this duo and enjoying wherever it goes next. So I would recommend it, but I would caution to say that I would encourage readers to pick this up if you do love an element of mystery, because if you only love fantasy but hate the mystery genre, this one might lean too much into the classic mystery tropes for your taste. And it really is the core of the story, the center of it, of what happened to this man and what is going on. And so you have to want to know that part because it is very much first a mystery story and second a fantasy story, not the other way around. I wouldn't describe this as epic fantasy. If you're more used to reading that, I think that you might find this to be something else that you maybe weren't expecting. So go with that as you're picking up the book so you don't be disappointed with the wrong expectations. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And you know the drill at the end of these videos. Please subscribe if you haven't already, like the video, comment down below, even if it's just a little emoji, and hit that little notification bell. That way you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.